When I was 15 or so, me and my group of friends all slept over at the leader of our friend's group's house. This dude lived in the most absolutely rural area of our rural town, basically in the middle of the woods, a house just absolutely surrounded by thick walls of trees. In the evening, we decided to go out and start a bonfire deep in the woods, so we packed up, got all of our materials, and went straight out into the woods. On the way to the spot that we'd be making our campfire at, he told us about how messed up and creepy his woods are, and the numerous things that he's seen. White, skinny figures peeking around his shed, staring at him and running off when he looked at it, screaming in whispers from the woods, figures watching him, all that stuff. It definitely set the mood pretty well. By around 7 at night, we had the campfire set up, and it was pitch black outside, as it was the middle of winter in New Hampshire. I can still remember just how creepy the whole vibe was that night too. You could not see a single thing besides the ring of light coming out from the fire. Everything else was just a black wall of nothingness. And the sound of the forest was so quiet that it was almost deafeningly loud if we didn't talk. We ended up needing more firewood or whatever that we were using for the campfire, along with some other things, so the leader takes me with him to go get it. Without a flashlight or any light source, me and him walk the 1.5 mile long trail back to his house in complete and utter darkness. And it was all good. We were talking, joking with each other, having a good time just hanging out when the first noises started. He immediately made me stop talking too. To my left and my right was a bunch of different sounds. Screaming, laughing, talking and whispering, shouting, people saying inaudible words. It sounded like there was maybe 20 people around us. The natural light vision had set in a decent amount, and I looked over at my friend who had his head down and didn't say a single word. Known for being a complete goofball and a wild, funny dude, I had never seen him look so shaken and serious in my life. He had this look to him that still kind of haunts me to this day, as we knew him and he portrayed himself as this fearless leader type of our group, and seeing him so shaken up and afraid was really, really unsettling. I started to say something along the lines of, "What the heck is that?" before he cut me off and told me to be quiet, face forward, and to not pay attention to any of the sounds. I did what he said, and the next 3 or so minutes was uncomfortable and terrifying. I remember feeling sick to my stomach, in fact. By the time that we reached his house, the sounds had sort of dissipated and stopped. We both grabbed what we needed to grab in silence, and that's when I could really listen to the sheer quietness of that night. No birds, no sticks falling, no sound, absurdly silent. We walked back to the campsite, and nothing else occurred that night, but it is still the most unsettling and bizarre experience that I have almost no explanation of. This could be a paranormal experience, although I'm still not ready to say that I know for sure. Whatever it was, though, it definitely had me terrified. So every summer, my family and some close friends would all travel from Southern California to the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains, along the CA-NV border, to the town of Bridgeport. If you've ever been, it's a really cool area. A big biker route is there, excellent outdoor camping and hiking in Yosemite high country rich in wildlife, crazy old history with native tribes and the gold rush of the West. It has Bodie Ghost Town nearby, and my favorite is the world-class trout fishing. Mark Twain even once stayed in the town way back in the day, which I thought was pretty cool. The town is small and has your typical 20-building Main Street USA to match the feel, all surrounded by rivers, lush meadows with cattle and horse ranches, and absolutely gorgeous wooded snow-capped mountains. We would often camp up near Twin Lakes just outside of town, about 10 miles, but always made a point to go to town for dinner at this bar, Reno's, for pizza, and beer as well, at least once during the trip. So, one night we do this, and afterwards we're on our way back to camp at twilight. just light enough to make out the peaks on the horizon, but still densely dark with billions of stars out in force. This road back to the camping area would sort of zigzag through the square-cut properties of ranch land. It's a narrow 2 lanes edged by barbed wire and an irrigation channel, and minimal streetlights, if any at all. Literally, you can only think of one installed by the Dude Ranch out there. So, we drive back to the camp, having to use our lights due to the dark and making sure to keep an eye out for deer. And when we finally pull into the camp, my mum immediately asks, "Did you see that kid in the swimsuit on the side of the road?" Perplexed and a little amused by the idea, I say, "No, where was this?" "On the other side of the road, near the cows. He was shirtless walking along the road." I had been driving behind her and my dad, and there was no way that I could have missed this had someone been there. Nobody in our car saw him too, and my dad said that he didn't either when she initially saw him. Which, if I'm being honest, is not really shocking for my dad though. However, also not shocking would be for my mum seeing something paranormal. It always seemed to follow her for whatever reason, and she was dead, excuse the pun, serious. Even described the color of the shorts, his hairstyle, said that he was walking the same direction that we were traveling, so she couldn't see his face, and had to have been in his 20s. So we half-jokingly jumped to that conclusion that maybe it was in fact a ghost. After all, it was dark and late. Nobody else had seen him, and even in the summer, the Sierra is high enough in elevation and has crazy enough weather to easily kill someone who wasn't prepared for the cold night, especially shirtless in swim trunks. On a clear night in August, I've woken up in the teens for temperature, and where she was describing was in the literal middle of nowhere in those fields. It takes us about 20 minutes just to drive it at a good speed, let alone walk it to camp in the dark, but I guess anything is possible. Anyway, the next morning we get up and learn about my idiot friend, someone who got scratched in a previous story that I've told, left the cooler out after the rest of us went to bed, and a bear got a buffet out of us, so we decided that we'll make the most of it and go back to town for supplies, some further fishing spots, and get dinner again. This time on the way back to the camp, I'm driving in front of my parents, zigging and zagging through the fields when all of a sudden there's a bright set of headlights on my tail. Looking back, I could tell that this had to be some sort of lifted truck, maybe a Bronco or similar rearing up on my SUV. So close at times that I thought he was about to ram me. I start speeding up a little at first, but this car stays right on me. I'm starting to get annoyed and concerned. After all, this was a 2-lane road at night that anyone wanting to pass could very easily and safely do so. There isn't any area that you could really pull over without risking pulling into a ditch and getting stuck. So I continue speeding up, but I'm getting concerned because I know the hills are coming up and there are deer by the thousands in this area. But this car just keeps pressing. My wife, then girlfriend, and friends start getting a little freaked as well, thinking about the backwoods human being that is pulling this, and this continues through the fields until I get to the final turn before it goes from meadows to woods. And I get a really heavy gut feeling, almost like a scream in my head to slow down. So, do or die, I start pressing the brakes hard, fully expecting this truck to ram us. As I do this, we're coming around the corner and, sure enough, there's a pack of 6 or so deer in the middle of the road. I was immediately a little shaken. It's always a little startling when you see animals out in the dark while driving, especially big ones, and then it dawns on me that I'm not being blinded anymore and we definitely didn't get hit. I look back in the mirror and the lights are gone. Just gone. No dust in the rear brake lights from a vehicle pulling off the road, nothing screaming by us in the other lane, and no road for them to have even turned off on, or headlights lighting up the trees or area or anything. And then I see my folks coming driving up behind us. All of us are dumbfounded trying to figure out where the heck this person went. The deer clear the road and we make the rest of the drive to camp. And adrenaline admittedly gets me a bit irritated, so I start ranting off about how stupid this guy was and how we could have died and blah blah blah. really making everyone feel good, right? When we get out of the cars, my mum immediately starts giving me the typical parent talk, but I get even more angry when she calls me an idiot for taking off like that on such a dangerous road in the dark, and how lucky I am to not have killed us with all those deer and how I need to be more careful, etc. Well, if that guy hadn't have been riding my tail so tightly, it wouldn't have been such an issue, I say. What are you talking about? She responds. There wasn't anyone behind you. Oh, how the tables have turned. Luckily for me, my wife and friends had experienced everything with me, and they start chiming in about the truck, and I start talking about how I finally had enough and listened to my gut and reason, deciding to slow down just as we came to find this deer, and how the truck was just gone after that. It gave my mum chills, and she apologized but told me to be careful next time, but then started laughing and saying how weird the trip had been. I'll give this to my mum, that she never did call us crazy for what we experienced in life, which is something that I think a lot of parents neglect to do for their kids. It's funny too, because I've always heard similar experiences from country towns back east or folklore of ghost trucks and thought that how stupid it all sounded. But now, after experiencing it, man, it is dangerous. Plain dangerous. I'd never wish that on anyone. This road hasn't given us any issues before or since then too, but I'll admit that I drive it with a lot more caution these days. I always wonder though if the shirtless guy and the truck were somehow connected, but never found anything out about it. I guess in the end, only God knows. So I grew up in Orange County, CA, but there were some real wild areas around us, believe it or not. In high school, we went out of this place called Black Star Canyon in the Cleveland National Forest, big densely wooded area of oak that stretches from OC to San Diego, almost to the border even. It also contains Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, and anyways, we had been told that it was haunted growing up. Turns out, true story, there was a tribe up there that was slaughtered in the 1800s by hired-for trappers because they kept stealing the Mexican ranchers' horses for meat. But for a dumb set of high schoolers, we planned a night hike to this place. My friends and I did stuff like this all the time, but I consider myself pretty skeptical, and luckily most of us were pretty level-headed. This area is pretty well known for mountain lions too, so we were all on guard and in agreement to turn around at any sign, even if just one of us wanted to. So, the way the trail works, you park at a forestry gate and start to walk along an old asphalt sort of narrow road that's mostly dirt from when there was sparse horses in the 50s or 60s before the floods washed them out, and the land was committed to NFS, eventually turning to a full hiking trail. Along this road is a line of barbed wire as well, with all kinds of signs warning you not to cross. So, here we are, typical idiots walking a road on a hardly slivered moon-pitch black night after midnight and not using our flashlights to add to the flare. And well, as we go and adventure deeper and deeper down this road, which we'd never been on, mind you, I keep seeing what appears to be a cowboy leaning on the wooden fence posts holding the barbed wire. Just kind of leaning on it, but distinctly looking at us. I'm talking like a full-blown cowboy brimmed hat, just leaning, but it's sort of just a silhouette out of the side of my eye, and every time that I look straight on, there's nothing. I'm telling myself that I'm being illogical and push it off as a trick of the eyes to keep my cool, but I keep seeing this guy every 10 or so posts that don't say anything to the others. We get to a point where we've been walking for maybe over an hour and debate on heading back, just because of the time. Just then, though, my friend goes, "Yeah, I keep thinking that I'm seeing a cowboy along the fence line." I instantly felt my stomach drop out of me. I couldn't believe it. These were plain wooden fence posts, maybe a typical 4 feet tall or so, with mostly field behind them. No way that looks like a person, so I open up about it also, and we all agree to turn around. Just then, my other buddy starts flipping out. ripping his shirt off, screaming about getting stung by something. We're all kind of confused, looking at him like he's crazy, but he insists that a bee or something just stung him. So we turn our lights on his back and watch as 3 distinct scratches from sort of stretching from one shoulder diagonal to the opposite hip, even drawing blood, were on his back. We were done, needless to say, after that, but we made it back to the car without any further incident. Now, you can probably argue the shadow was coincidence in the dark and shapes playing tricks on our eyes. Sure, I'll give you that much. But throwing the scratch in a way that we'd watched happen right as we were discussing this ghost cowboy, and in a way that there's just no possible way he could have done that to himself, and none of us standing in a circle did it to him, there has to be something going on, right? This area ended up being used by Jack Osborne's show Haunted Highway in his pilot episode 2. It's pretty cool, and I've been back since then, but only in the day. California has more to it than you'd imagine, I suppose, but this is just one story of many that I've experienced out here. So, this encounter actually isn't mine. It was told to us. And the guy who told us this, his name was Mark. Mark is a man that specializes in removing asbestos. Being a man that works in a trade, he probably has seen and heard some strange things in his time. And well, Mark came to remove some, as you guessed it, asbestos from our kitchen ceiling. He had to set up a test first to see if the asbestos was dangerous or not. This roughly took around an hour. My mum made him a cup of tea. They both sat down in the living room and began a conversation that led to the following story while waiting for the test to be done. It was a normal day in the trade. Wake up, get ready, head out. Mark had a job located in a sort of loft or attic this day, so he wasted no time and got straight to the house that needed work. Upon arrival, Mark knocked into the house and was greeted by a woman who was the wife of the man of the house. Mark explained who he was and what he does and why he was there. He also specified that he needed to speak with her husband for whatever reason. The lady then told Mark that he was not at home and hasn't been so for like 3 days. Mark then questioned the lady about her husband. He's been missing for 3 days now. He does this from time to time. He'll just disappear out of the blue and won't have contact with anyone for several days, she said. Okay, that's weird. Maybe he's been having an affair? Anyhow, Mark told the lady that he had to start the job today, so she let him in, and she had no other choice, really. Mark then heads up into the loft with his tools, and this is where it gets really creepy. Mark is instantly greeted with the body of the husband hanging from the attic ceiling. The husband, he wasn't missing at all. He was in fact in the attic for 3 days straight, dead. The man had unfortunately ended himself and must have been planning it for a while if the disappearing was a regular recurrence. But the thought of even going to sleep while your husband is above your head like that, that's a crazy thought. I'm really sorry to whoever has experienced something like this, or to anyone who has lost someone to suicide like this. But I felt compelled to share this story because I guess we should always be grateful for those in our lives. So to set the scene, it was my significant other, a 2-year-old, and myself in a 1-bedroom apartment. The 2-year-old's bed was close to the wall by the door, and our bed was on the other side of the room, but to where I could see our 2-year-old and also see the bathroom door, which was located just outside the room. So it first started out with, like minor bad feelings. The usual walk into the apartment and feel that something is off sort of vibe. Just bad vibes all around. One night, though, while we were sleeping, I had woken up to a strange feeling that our 2-year-old was up to something that she shouldn't have been. The room is completely dark, so I sit up to have a sort of look around, and almost immediately this small shadow catches my eye. It's my 2-year-old. She's standing at the entrance of the bathroom looking back at me and then proceeded to sidestep into the bathroom out of view. I wake up my significant other and ask them, "Hey, wake up. Why is our 2-year-old out of their bed? How did they climb out? What are you talking about? They're in their crib, asleep. My eyes finally adjusted to the dark, and I see my 2-year-old sleeping peacefully in their crib. My heart starts picking up pace at this point as I'm trying to figure out who did I just see walk into our bathroom. So I get out of bed and I rush into the bathroom ready to catch whoever it is. I flip on the light, but the bathroom is completely empty. It's just me staring at my reflection in the mirror. I turn off the light and head back to bed, confused about what had just happened and not too sure what I saw. Fast forward a few nights and I'm still thinking about what just happened. There I am, in my bed next to my significant other with 2-year-old sound asleep. Again, I wake up to this strange feeling like we're being watched. I open my eyes, my body is still. I'm paralyzed, trapped in my own body. My eyes search across the room and I look at the door to our bedroom, and what I saw made my heart stop. There was this man at our bedroom door, but something about him was off, completely, like he was something otherworldly in a man's body. He was more shadow than detail, and his posture hunched like he was trying to be quiet, like he was stalking prey. The shadow man begins to creep towards me, lurching closer to our bed. My mind is racing. I'm thinking, tonight's the night. An invader has finally entered our home and I was the only one awake. I start planning my attack and what I'm going to do to defend my family, but my body is still immobilized. The intruder, though, then does the unthinkable. He places one foot on my bed, then the other, and slowly starts creeping higher and higher up the bed. He's standing over me, and in the quick moment of fear that I was able to break out of and kick both my legs up towards the shadow man, hoping to catch him by surprise and ready to leap at him. As I kicked up, I felt the weight of my blanket fly off my body. I wasn't going to wait to hear the sound of a thud as he fell back. I was in fight or flight, and my only focus was jumping on this thing as fast as possible and keeping my family safe. My violent kick wakes my significant other up in panic. I get up ready to pounce when I see that there's no one there. What is going on? There was a man in our room. I kicked him. He was right there. The room is empty and dark. No man, no intruder, no sound. Silence is broke by my wife telling me to check the rest of the apartment, and after I looked around, there was nobody there. I go back to bed and try to sleep, but my adrenaline was still pumping, so sleep wasn't really on the table that night. A few months after this event, we decided to move and upgrade to a bigger place to live, and since moving there, there hasn't been any of the bad vibes at the apartment. No shadow man, no little girl, just the three of us, thankfully. Growing up in the 90s, I spent a lot of time outside just playing with the neighborhood kids. I didn't live in the greatest neighborhood though, so I couldn't really go out exploring, but all of my neighbors had kids my age, except one. It was an old house with a garage across the yard and stuff piled up so high in the windows that you couldn't see inside. The only noticeable objects were an old Barbie camper and a teddy bear with a missing ear. I knew that somebody was living there though, because their ugly, and I mean ugly, red Chevy car would leave the driveway right at noon and wouldn't come back until like 9 p.m. And one night it came back, and the next day there was a boy standing in the yard shouting and waving at me. I was playing in an old dip in my backyard where a tree had been cut down when I saw him. I remember sort of being confused as well, but I was a kid and was excited to meet someone new that was my age. I found out his name was Brandon, and I would always invite him to play outside after school. My mum didn't question me about my new friend, so she let him come play in the backyard. I never saw him at school, and he said that his grandma taught him from their house. I didn't want to play with the other neighborhood kids as much as I wanted to play with Brandon, so the two of us formed our own little group and we played in that dip in my backyard. Nobody really questioned it until I told my mum that I wanted to have school at my house like Brandon. She finally asked me where I met Brandon, and I told her that he lived in the dirty house on Harrison. I remember the look on my mum's face being confused and concerned at first, but then she laughed in my face and told me that I was being ridiculous. Brandon was my imaginary friend because nobody had lived in that house since the 70s. I got mad at her and said that I would prove that Brandon was real and that he would be outside the next day. But he never showed up. In fact, I waited for him every day for quite some time, but I never saw him again. Eventually, we moved across town into an apartment, and I made new friends and forgot about Brandon, but a few years ago I felt nostalgic and decided to go for a drive through my old neighborhood. Not much had changed, and seeing the old neighborhood made me happy and brought back a lot of fun memories until I passed that old house, that is. It was obviously abandoned, but after all these years, the old Barbie camper and the teddy bear with the missing ear was still in that window. I saw that and laughed at how I'd stuck to the idea that my imaginary friend was real until I saw my ball. An old ball with my name written on it in big black ink was clearly visible from the window. The rainbow colors made it stick out like a sore thumb. I had lost that ball around the same time that I'd first met Brandon. And I mean, maybe one of the neighborhood kids had stolen it years ago and had hidden it away, and I just now saw it and took notice of it. Maybe Brandon was just a figment of my overactive childhood imagination. Or maybe there was someone watching me back then and I was too innocent to see anything else other than a new friend. Thinking about it does creep me out a bit, but more than anything, I wish that I just had some answers. I mean, if he really was real, if he was another kid playing a prank, or if he was a lost spirit, and it bothers me that I'll never really have the answers. But I'll always have the memories, I guess, if they're accurate. As creepy as the memories are, they do make me happy and pique my curiosity, but I do have to wonder if maybe there really was a kid there, and maybe I was being coaxed into something. Who knows? So, I haven't really shared this, but I had an experience about a year ago now that I just cannot stop thinking about. You see, I was fast asleep but having horrible nightmares. Nightmares are nothing new for me, being former military and current firefighter EMT. But these weren't the typical reliving bad days nightmares. They were vivid dreams about bad things happening to friends and family, things that never happened in real life. I woke up drenched in a sweat and immediately became aware of a large black figure leaning over me, and another one seated in a chair across the room. I immediately thought, so this is what sleep paralysis is like, because I've never experienced it before. But I quickly realized that I wasn't actually paralyzed. I could in fact move. Once I moved my arm, the figure leaning over me seemed to notice this as well, stood up and took a step back. Then both figures just faded away. Now, I've had paranormal experiences my entire life, but there have only been 2 or 3 times that truly terrified me, and that was definitely one. It happened once, and I'd never seen the figures or had those nightmares since that night, and I thought that I would open it for discussion to see what other people think might have happened that night. In the fall of 2019, I was going through a really rough patch. I was extremely depressed and in a very dark place at the time. So when my friend invited me to go to the Davy Crockett National Forest with him to camp, I was more than happy to oblige. We decided that we would camp at the Ratcliffe Lake campgrounds for 2 nights, and then the 3rd night we would stay at a free camping spot somewhere off the miles of park roads scattered throughout the forest. The first couple of days went by amazingly too. I loved the smell of pines, especially in East Texas, and the campsite was beautiful, not to mention the lake. We did some kayaking and hiking, and the views really helped my mindset. It was awesome, but on the 3rd morning, my friend got an emergency call and had to bail at the last second. I was a little bit upset, but it didn't necessarily mean I had to go home just because he did. So I decided to stick to the original plan and find a place to camp deep within the forest. After he left, I headed to the nearest forest information center and snagged a map. The map showed the nearby highways and the forest and whatnot. I scouted a couple of park roads and made my way towards them. After about maybe 5 miles out of town, I find a park road which is indicated by a numbered sign and is only a dirt road. I head down it and settle in for the adventure. The road wasn't very narrow, but it would have been a hassle to move 2 trucks around each other, which I didn't really encounter, thankfully. I kept the map on my lap and followed the road with my fingers while also checking the road ahead for potholes and stuff. Now, the woods got super dense around me and darker as I kept going, and it all kind of just enveloped my truck at one point. I don't know how many miles I travelled before I first came to another turnoff, but it was clear that I was really deep in the woods. I travelled to where one group of campsite was supposed to be, which was a small loop basically. I turned down and, to my surprise, was met with a couple of trucks and RVs, all occupants outside cleaning guns or dressing deer. Please don't come at me, I've never been hunting. It was hunting season, so I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise, but it was still very off-putting though with the looks that I was receiving. So I made the loop and I just continued on. I drove a couple more miles and found another remote spot at the very corner of the woods. I pulled over and set up the tent and a fire and brought out the whiskey. I didn't have a great night and was just burning some letters, so I got a little bit more messed up than I would have cared to be. So I ate some food, put out the fire and headed into the tent to play the Switch and just wind down a bit. It didn't take me too long to fall asleep and I slept pretty hard that night. But I woke up at around 1 o'clock in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I'm a very avid camper, so I just assumed that it was a critter checking out the human who decided to chill in his pad without asking. So I started to drift off again when I heard a loud cough, and at that I was instantly awake. I just kind of laid there listening, and the footsteps, they approached my truck. I had locked my truck, thankfully, but heard the obvious sign of someone trying to handle, then quietly shuffling over to the other side and trying the other handle. I had a spotlight that I brought with me, so I quietly unzipped the tent and pointed my light in the direction of the noise and shouted out. And I caught a brief glimpse of whoever it was in all camo sprint off into the woods with no light. Like, they took off, and although I had no plans on following them, I scanned the brush with my light and couldn't see anything. I turned off my light to see if I could see a phone light or a flashlight, but instead I heard a very loud crashing into the brush that just got quieter and further away. So, whoever this person was ran into the dark woods with no light and in all camo. Considering the map and the direction that he ran also didn't have any more roads or amenities, maybe he was on private property or something. I don't know, but I was very scared, obviously, so I collapsed my tent, put it in the bag, shoved it in my back seat, and drove the park roads like a bat out of hell that day. Once I got back to the main road, I drove for 4 hours back to my hometown, and I want to go back sometime, but this time definitely with friends, and maybe even a gun too. But yeah, that was not a fun experience, and definitely up there with one of the most frightening things that has ever happened to me in the woods. The story takes place in the early spring of 2016. I was living in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and came home to spend a bit of time with my high school friends. One of my favorite things to do was camp together and hike, since we all had heavy affinity for the outdoors. And on this particular occasion, we decided to tent camp at the park on Lake Georgetown in Georgetown, Texas. It was a public campsite, but I guess because of the time of year, we were really the only ones in the park. So with this, we picked a site very close to the water. We had a fun night, had a fire, drank some mead that my friend had made, and used a hooker in the tent. Bad idea. Coal fell out and burnt a hole through the bottom in the end. And just talked about random things that we were up to now that we had graduated high school. We ended the night by the fire, drinking and eating some canned food. One by one, each of us left the fire and retired into the tent. Me and my best friend were the last ones in, and since we were right up by the water, we filled up a bucket with lake water, separated the logs, and doused the fire. Then we both drunkenly meandered our way over to the tent. Now, I've always had trouble sleeping. Even when I'm drinking, I tend to just sort of linger in reality for a bit. So I just laid on my back and stared at the stars through the screen ceiling. I'm not completely sure, too, when I did fall asleep. Probably hours later, but I do remember waking up to a bright orange light. At first, I thought that maybe my friend went to grab something out of the truck and unlocking it triggered the parking lights. But this orange light got bigger and moved too much to be stationary lights. So I slowly unzipped the tent flap and saw that the fire was going again. Now, this has happened to me before. If you don't douse a fire enough, it can still reignite with enough oxygen, or depending if something was thrown in there, it could burn for a while. But when I noticed that there were pieces of fabric and paper and that the fire was going, I woke up my friends and they're all as creeped out as I was. And that's when we saw at the edge of some of the brush that there was a guy out there in a red jacket and kind of balding. I think Mr. Noodle from Elmo's World, staring at us with a blank stare and an empty bottle in his hand. It made our blood run cold, but also being dumb kids, we decided to run after this guy, but he had already started to head out before we made that decision and got away somehow. We really didn't sleep after that, and we left the next day and called whoever manages the park about the incident. We had checked the fire to see if anything was salvageable or identifiable, but unfortunately, everything was just incinerated. They told us that Georgetown PD would do more rounds in the park, but in the end, that was about it. We quickly forgot about it too, because it was a pretty one-off experience, and the dude didn't really hurt us directly, and of course we all started going to college and stuff, but still, it's something that I won't forget easily. So I lived alone in a bad neighborhood just outside of the city. At this point, I'd been living there for maybe 3 years with no incident. Well, I mean, there were several shootings on my street, but no one shot at me, so no incident, I guess. I'm the kind of person, though, who can't sit still for very long, so I find myself standing or pacing a lot. On this particular night, maybe at about 2 a.m., I was pacing while reading a textbook to prepare for an up-and-coming test at my university. I stopped pacing for a little and just stood near my front door to read, and that's when I heard my doorknob turn. For some reason, though I nearly jumped out of my skin, I was able to calmly look down at my deadbolt to double-check that it was locked, and it was. I looked through the peephole to see who was trying to come in, but no one was standing there. Obviously, this was really confusing. I neither am superstitious nor believe in the supernatural, but I'm also stupid, so my first thought was, is a ghost trying to break into my house? Thankfully, that thought gave way to a more logical thought of maybe they're just going around the back. So I quickly moved to the back door to make sure it was locked, and it was, but then my front doorknob turned again. I sort of tiptoe ran to the front door. At this point, my heart is pounding. My dog, a big protective teddy bear, is looking at me with major concern in his eyes. I look through the front peephole again, but there's still nobody there. But that's when I hear a small knock on my door, as I'm looking through the peephole of all things. And then a small child voice says, "Let me in." Silence, and then "Let me in." I'm still looking through the peephole while covering my mouth with my hand to make sure my breathing is quieter, Through the peephole, I see a small 3-year-oldish girl walk to the edge of my porch and look into my bushes. She nods and then says, "Okay," in what I think was supposed to be a whisper. She walks closer to the door again, and I lose sight of her in the peephole. She tries the handle again and then knocks and says, "Please help me." My uncle is a cop, so I had heard about people using children as a way to get people to open their door before blitz attacking them. So I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening at this point. I really was not sure how to handle this situation, if I'm being honest, so I just said, not even into a phone, "Hi, I think someone is trying to break into my apartment. Yeah, my address is," and I gave my street name and number. "Yeah, I'll stay on the line." And then I saw a shadow emerge from the bushes. Thankfully, they scooped this kid up and ran off, and there were 2 people and the kid. There were people trying to break into my apartment that night to rob or do something to me. I'm really glad that the doors were locked and that I had my wits about me, because if I hadn't, who knows what would have happened. So this happened when I was around 13 and it was summer, so that meant no more school. I would often spend my evenings with my cousin, who lived close by to me, and we would ride our bikes around the neighborhood until sunset. One day, it was the usual, but we happened to stop in front of a house and take a short break. As we're posted up just sort of talking, a middle-aged man approached us. He looked to be around maybe his 40s, tall and hairy with a big black mustache. He was wearing a grey sweatsuit with the hoodie over his hat. He looked like he just went out on a jog because he was super sweaty, but he approached us with a big grin. He then proceeded to ask for our names and what we were doing here. I quickly got the creepy gut feeling that something was off about this guy. I then realized that he was far more interested talking to my cousin in a flirty way. My cousin was only 13, just like me, but she looked a little older, although it was noticeable that she was still a minor. The creepy man kept asking questions, which I ignored because I found it odd. So my cousin kept answering his questions, and he then finally asked how old we were, and my cousin told him our age. I thought that he would finally get the memo after that and stop talking to us, but as soon as he heard our age range, he quickly had an eerie grin on his face and paused for a few seconds. He then mentioned that he has a niece our age and she would love to meet us and wants us all to become friends. He kept insisting that she would love us, and when we declined his offer, his tone changed and he started sort of gaslighting us. He kept saying that we'll make her cry if we don't go and that we're just mean girls for not going to meet her, etc. He keeps looking around our surroundings to see if anyone is nearby. He then starts offering us soda. He claims it's too hot to be outside and we should at least have a soda at his house. After saying no thank you, he keeps insisting he has all types of drinks available at home. This kept going on for a good 10 minutes as well, of him convincing us to go to his house, and we kept saying no thanks multiple times till he finally gave in and just left. He didn't say goodbye or anything, he just turned and stormed away all angry. We still lived in that area for a few more years before moving, and strangely enough, we never once saw this man ever again. Looking back at this situation, we were very vulnerable for 13 years old and would often get into trouble, and we could have easily went with him in his house to get free soda, and, well, who knows what could have happened then. And I mean, no grown man in their right mind keeps insisting that 13-year-olds should go into his house, right? So this takes place in the late 90s when my mum decided that she was tired of living in the big city and she bought a house in the countryside. She'd always been a bit of a loner and was desperate for some peace and quiet, so she found a house in a very small village that was in really bad condition and decided to handle all the renovations by herself. She quickly realized that it was too much and started asking around the village if somebody could help her out. Quite quickly, she met Daniel, and he offered to do most of the manual labor for a very cheap price. Daniel was a very simple man. He never went outside the village and wasn't educated at all. He could barely read, but my mum was a teacher and she saw something in him. And despite the lack of education and knowledge, she knew almost right away that this man was extremely intelligent. He just had no idea. She started giving him books, helped him perfect his reading and writing skills. He was an extremely fast learner, and in a few months, he was a different man completely. He came over every day to talk to her, read, and sometimes work on the house. He also helped her through her pregnancy and helped out when I was a baby. I truly wish, too, that the story would end here, but it doesn't. The way he talked and his opinions and thoughts about the world had changed, and it made him very different from everyone else in the village, including his own family. People who were teasing him about it at first started to really resent him. They were mean and stopped talking or interacting with him in any way because they thought he had become presumptuous and arrogant. My mum was the only one who still talked to him, so he started to resent her for, changing him and started to drink a lot to dull his brain. He got drunk every day and hoping he would get back to where he was and would be accepted by everyone again, but of course that's not how it works. Now, when I turned 4, my mum told him that we were going back to the city so I could attend a good school, and we'd probably be back only once in a while. And at that, he completely snapped. Not only did she give him a poisonous gift that was ruining his life, she was leaving him all alone with absolutely no one else to talk to. That day, he left screaming, and a few hours later, his car crashed into our garden. I remember my mum being very calm and telling me to go hide under her bed upstairs. I rushed upstairs and looked through the window, and I saw him coming out of his car with difficulty. He was mildly hurt by the crash, but mostly super drunk and angry. My mum was walking towards him when he began swinging out with a huge axe, and she came running inside. She locked the door immediately and called the police, and he started yelling that he was going to kill us and destroyed our car with his axe. And when he was done, he started destroying the door as well. He came in, climbed up the stairs, and used the axe to destroy the bedroom door. Thankfully, the police arrived just before he managed to get through, and they arrested him, and unfortunately, he died a few days later. I think it was because of liver failure or something like that. I honestly don't know if he would have actually followed through with his threats, and I don't know if he loved my mum or if it was just really because he was upset. Now, that's all a big mystery. I am still very scared every time I think about it, though, and axes still terrify me. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this crazy little story, and thanks for listening. So this happened maybe about 2 years ago now while riding quads with my boyfriend. It wasn't too late at night, maybe around 10 p.m. I would guess. We were camping out at our campground where we have a small trailer surrounded by other camps. In the summer it's full of kids running around and adults on golf carts and stuff. But it was late December and we're one of the few people who go up in the winter since it gets pretty cold here and they shut the water off. The woods are a decent bit away from the actual campground. It gets pretty quiet out there, and something about the snow just makes everything quieter as well, I guess. I've always felt slightly uncomfortable in the woods at night. My boyfriend told me that I was just a paranoid person, and I chalked it up to me reading too much creepypastas as a kid. I always felt somewhat safer since we were on a quad, and we can go pretty fast if needed. So, there we were, in the middle of the night, enjoying a cold ride, drifting in the snow, when all of a sudden we come to a stop. That's when I just got this really eerie feeling, and I asked him why he stopped, and it was something along the lines of with his gloves or something the quad came off, and he turned the quad off and bent over messing with something. I start looking behind and around me because I'm just someone who's super aware of their surroundings. I look to my left and I see a brown skinny tree that always freaks me out because I mistake it as something else. Then I look to the right of the scary tree and see something even taller and pale looking. I immediately avert my attention from it being totally freaked out. I find the courage to look back, and this time, it seems closer. This time I didn't have my glasses on, and I was just saying it's another tree that looks like a person and I'm fine. But before I can say anything to my boyfriend, he had finished whatever he was doing and we took off. I buried my face into the back of his jacket, too afraid to see anything else, and still having that feeling of being watched over me, I asked if we can go back to the camp. He agreed since it was so cold. I decided not to say anything to him since he'd want to go back and investigate or straight up not believe me and write me off as paranoid again, and I did not want to go back there at all. I figured the following day we would go back into the woods during the daytime and I would see that there was another tree there that I never noticed before. But when we went back through and there was nothing next to the brown tree, that was when my stomach dropped. That's also when I told him I saw something last night. He told me that I should have told him, which he was right. I probably should have said something, but I was just too scared and just kept it to myself. We still go up there occasionally, not as much due to our jobs now, but thankfully I've never experienced anything else after that. So, I'm going to start with the creepy but the natural. I've been a hunter since I was probably 13, maybe earlier. I don't really remember, but being out in the woods since I was very young means that I get to see or hear things that I normally wouldn't while living in the cities. I've had a few different instances where I've been very creeped out in the woods, and so I'd like to cover a few of them, and the last story is the one that you guys will probably like to hear. So in my state, you've got a handful of primary predators out in the woods. We've got bears, wolves, cougars, but I'll start with a funny one that will butter you up a bit. The guy who owns the land that we hunt on, he decided that it was going to be a good idea to store some of his equipment on his land, one of which was a styrofoam float. One year we go out there to go and check on that stuff, to go pick it up, and that big piece of styrofoam had met its demise to a black bear. And you can tell that the bear had a heck of a lot of fun tearing up that styrofoam because there are just clouds of it everywhere, and it had been throwing pieces of styrofoam all around, like a bomb went off. I hope that the bear was okay, but he didn't eat any of it, I don't think, and we did manage to get it cleaned up eventually. On another occasion, I was actually stalked by a cougar a few years back. When we had a deer opener, I like walking the road occasionally, and one of the first things that I noticed that year, which I wish I would have taken a picture of, was a set of tracks, really big cat tracks. This cat was obviously stalking other animals in the area, but me being me, I decided that I shouldn't be scared of it, that it would probably be more scared of me, but sure enough, I must have jinxed myself. I attempted to do a deer push by going through some of the really thick brush to try and scare up a deer or two and get it to move towards the other hunters in my party. I'm moving through the woods and I can hear something moving behind me, and every time I would stop, that noise would stop too. Eventually I got so unnerved, especially with the forest getting quiet, that I decided that if I'm going to get attacked by something, that I'd rather be facing it. So I turned around and I walked straight back the way that I came with my rifle raised. When I began retreating back to where I'd come from, directly towards whatever it was making the following noises, I saw a tanned flash of fur and a long tail pretty low to the ground turn around and run away from me. The next day, as I was doing a walk up the main road with my rifle, I was close to the tree line on the side of the road when I heard a deep growl immediately to my right. I turned with my rifle up to see the face of a cougar at my stomach level because it was raised up on and out of the brush. I calmly backed away and walked back up the road that I'd come from and apologized for disturbing her. Now, though, for the wolves. A few years back, my dad shot a deer and we gutted it. If anyone here is familiar with the field dressing of an animal, then you typically leave the gut pile just out of the woods. This was like the year that we found out that there was a wolf pack that moved up on the property, so my dad leaves the gut pile a couple of 100 yards from the stand. The day after, I was sitting in my dad's stand while he was doing a big loop on the property to try and scare deer towards me. As he was getting close to me, which I didn't know at that time, I was sitting in the stand and I heard a wolf kind of yelp or howl from the gut pile. I texted my dad and told him that he better hurry up and get back because there was a wolf pack somewhere between us. And sure enough, by the time that he'd made it back to me, he told me that he'd also heard the same thing and it was within probably 100 yards of him. This year, just in November, I actually took pictures of some old tracks on one of the trails next to my size 13 boot. The tracks are huge and I know there's one set of 4 that were walking together. The picture that I took are the biggest tracks though, and I'd have to ask them if that wolf is probably like 200 pounds or more. Anyway, now for the one that sticks with me. So somewhere around 2006 or 2007, I was a late teen. I was at my grandparents' cabin with them and my cousin. This was the summer in northwestern Wisconsin, Danbury to be specific, and the incident happened midday when the sun was high in the sky and it was pretty warm out. So my cousin and I decided that we would play some airsoft, and I was wearing some camouflage and decided that I would have a better chance of not being seen and being able to ambush him by going into the woods, which was about an acre attached to where the cabins were. Well, what I mean is that it's miles of woods, but the acre is what my grandparents owned. We usually just stayed on the land that they owned, and it had sort of cut trails into it, a big circle with one entrance. It sort of split into a Y and loops back around. And this is what we used as a short ATV trail. As we were battling with the airsoft guns, we continued all the way up into the trail about halfway. We were both sort of winded and at the top of the hill next to a clearing in the woods when I decided to mess with my cousin and shush him and tell him that we were being watched. Now, mind you, I intended this as a joke, but when we both got quiet, I realized the woods were dead quiet. Like you could hear a pin drop quiet. Really, I could only hear my own breathing and immediately felt like we were actually being watched. So I sort of looked in the direction of where I felt this was coming from, and I scanned the edge of the clearing, which on the other side of the clearing there's another hill that goes down to a watering hole or a pond. So we would often see animals at the edge of that clearing. They usually would just run off like deer and whatnot, but anyway, I scanned from the left to the right and then back, and halfway on the right to the left visual scan I saw white and I sort of focused on it. And that's when it came into focus. The white that I saw were actually teeth. Teeth in the mouth of what looked like a wolf panting. Except this wolf was extremely tall for a wolf. Like to my stomach or my chest, and I'm 6'4". As I was taking in these details, I began to realize that this thing was staring at us. Maybe even more at my cousin to my left, and I also realized that this wolf was not on all fours, but crouching on its back legs, leaning against a tree, with its arms wrapped around the tree. Yeah, that's right, I said arm. This thing had like arms with hands, just like us, except it had long nails or claws as its fingertips. In the short time that I looked, I tried to absorb as much information as I could, and I said to my cousin, "We have to go." My cousin took off like a bat out of hell. Being a baseball player, he was faster than me, and he ran, and I looked back at the creature, and it just locked on with laser focus onto my cousin, and stood all the way up and began to run towards us, which is exactly the point when I turned and ran also. What I remember from when it stood up was that it was significantly taller than I was. When completely upright, it was huge, and when I ran, I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me. When I reached the Y in the trail, my cousin was standing there waiting for me, and I told him to just go, and we ran into the parking area by the shed and stopped and talked about it because it sounded like it had stopped chasing us. At some point, we both agreed to not tell our grandparents what we saw, but we both agreed that, essentially, it looked like a werewolf. We also thought that it was probably not a good idea to go back, and we agreed that we would refer to it as a bear from now on. Unfortunately, my cousin never actually got a really good look at it, other than a bit of a flash of reddish-brown fur, but then again, maybe he's the lucky one because I still think about it from time to time, especially when I'm out enjoying the great outdoors. Also, even afterward, I always just had a bad feeling there, especially at night, by the campfire. I just always felt like there was something at the top of the hill in the tree line watching us. One of the things that is good to remember too when you're out in the woods is that if the woods do go quiet, like eerily quiet, this sometimes means that there's likely a big predator in the area, and if you get a gut feeling, then you should follow it. Gut feelings are instincts, and we have them for a reason, and my instincts told me that I had to react immediately because if I had frozen, I think I wouldn't be here.